Hello, and welcome to the very last in this version of the White Women Talk White Women series. I am Jessica Letaw, here with my beloved friend and colleague, Patricia Berry. Hello, Patricia. Let's talk a little bit about who we are, and then we'll get into the working agreements, and then we'll get into the stuff of the stuff for tonight. So I'll start. My name is Jessica Letaw. I usually go by Jess, she, her pronouns. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm originally from Atlanta and Athens, Georgia. And I'm here. Oh, we'll get into why I'm here. But I'm here in part because Patricia invited me. And whenever Patricia wants to have a good conversation, it is going to be a good conversation. And it has been.
And I am Patricia Berry. She, her, hers are my pronouns. I am a white woman who grew up in the West and lived most of my adult life on the Upper West Side of New York City. I've been a fundraiser in big institutions for about 25, 30 years. And the last 5 years, I have been free range as a fundraising consultant, particularly thinking about being a troublemaker, disturbing the peace of philanthropy, and figuring out how to fundraise without being a jerk, or worse words, depending on what platform you're on. But LinkedIn will cancel us if I use all my words. Cis, hetero, identify as female. I don't know what else. I have many other identities. Those are just some of them. Mm-hmm. And I came to this conversation because I have been recurating my LinkedIn feed. And one of the groups and people that came into this feed was Syra Rao and Regina Jackson in this book, White Women, Everything You Already Know About Your Own Racism and How to Do Better. And it's been a lovely conversation with my beloved friend Jess as we work on our own racism and centering of our whiteness and how to figure out how to undo those things. We had a great conversation about you can't really unlearn that, but you can compensate and become more aware. Do you agree, Jess, that that was kind of what we arrived at?
I do, although I think I have a more complicated relationship to unlearning. I think you can, but I also think it's a process. I don't think it's like you can learn something.
Oh, I read this book and now I'm fixed.
I don't know that you can get to an unlearning. I think unlearning is something you do, not a place you get.
And one of the reasons I love having this conversation publicly with Jess is because part of my lifelong step by step by step by moment towards unraveling my own racism and restricted thinking that I grew up with and got enculturated with is that Jess and I do that. We unwrap together, and it happens in community and it happens in conversation, and it's held in love, but it's also held really strongly with boundaries and calling in and calling on and all that kind of stuff. So our encouragement in doing this publicly is how do you create that community among your white women friends to create a culture that supports and helps that work, so that we as a group become a force for better. I struggle with the word good, but for a better evolution of ourselves. I feel like I have a very
You're reaching for the
I'm reaching for something today.
Which brings us into we will be talking a little bit about how Patricia and I constructed this conversation, as she said, in order to be able to hopefully give you tools to bring this out into your friend circles, your colleague circles, your family circles, and in ways to sort of build your muscles too and how to have these conversations. So to start that, let's talk about the working agreements that we establish with each other, and then we say why, and then we say what they are. Let's say what they are, and then maybe say why, and then that'll take us really nicely into the next conversation. So let me start by pulling them up on the screen. Here we go. Let's look at them. Okay. So the first one, and I think the one that Patricia and I went to first and fastest, was that we put aside the right to comfort in these conversations. Over the course of the series, we have gone into many of the reasons behind this, but what we keep coming back to is because the world isn't a safe place for our Black, Brown, and Indigenous and other people of color sisters, then this learning can't be a safe place. It has to be a brave place. So we call ourselves into loving accountability. Patricia, you and I have known each other and loved each other for a long time. We have known each other and loved each other well enough to hold up mirrors when they needed holding up. And we've done that in these conversations too. And we recognize and we say explicitly that kindness and honesty are not mutually exclusive.
And we also have expectation that we can ask for the speed that we need. So while we don't have a right to comfort, we are allowed to approach our learning in a way that allows us reflection, to pause and consider, and to, a lot of times for me, it's unpacking, like, oh, I want to say yes to that, but let me sit and think about that for a minute. So being able to pause, reflect, take a breath, and not just regurgitate things that we've read, because we're very good students. I think all of us are very good students. But to really think about filtering that through a lived experience and a personal self-reflection requires the speed that you need.
And I want to say something to that because
Sure.
you and I a couple of times have picked up on a slight tension between no right to comfort but asking for what we need. And I've been thinking about it this whole series, and I think I finally got to why this isn't actually in conflict with each other. Is that asking for what you need, like the speed you need, is a way of keeping yourself moving forward in the learning. And you said something similar to this in the last session, which is how I got there, is that it's not about asking for the comfort that you need to stop the learning. It's asking for the conditions that you need to continue. And sometimes your brain just needs a second, not to tap out, but to take in.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thank you for that nuance.
Took me a minute. Yeah.
Well, that's why I dig these conversations.
That's why we're here. That's right.
We also have an expectation to resist binary thinking. So no right and wrong, no good and bad. Everything's on a gradient, and a lot of it depends on what context you're in, who you're working with, engaging with at the time. So that nuance, that gradient, I think is the word that I'm looking for, allows us to be better able to evolve in this work rather than kind of having a right, wrong, either or.
And then the last thing that we have used to kind of create this container for these conversations is that we explicitly welcome conflict. In part, we recognize that in dominant culture and in the Midwest, where we are, and as women, where we are forever, we are often rewarded for being nice instead of being real, and for being conciliatory instead of leaning into necessary disagreement. So, in this space, Patricia and I invite ourselves and you a lot of emotional space to be in conflict with each other, with the ideas being presented, and even with yourselves. And to that extent, to that end, I would also like to invite anybody who is watching this on the onlines, please feel free to drop into the chat, talk to us, talk to each other. We have had some really lovely conversations in these sessions before, including with folks who have stumbled upon the sessions after the fact and kind of resonated with the ideas. So even if it's not live, even if you're coming across these after May of 2023, please feel free to join the conversation within this container. So Patricia, I wonder if we can say a little bit about why we made these. I'm sorry, did I step on you?
Awesome. No, that was going to be what we think is one.
We do.
Yes. Why did we make these agreements, and why do we revisit them at the beginning of each of these conversations? And I will say, as a practice, Jess and I, when we're working with groups, when I'm working with boards or other people, like bringing in a business sense at the beginning of each meeting, even if you're meeting once a week, your normative agreements, normative didn't sound right, your norms and expectations And reiterating them is a very important part of the work. And I'm going to open up the floor to Jess to talk about why that might be for you. Why do you think it's important that we kind of do this redundant thing of talking about those agreements all the time?
Because I don't think it's redundant. For me, one of the roles that saying them every single time plays is keeping them fresh. So Patricia and I have language for each of the working agreements, and we do draw on those for every session to be able to explain what each agreement is. And we also think carefully each time about what it is and why we're putting it forward. And so for me, they stay very immediate. And I stay close to why we created them, asking for the speed that we need, welcoming conflict, especially the first and last ones for me, welcoming conflict and no right to comfort. Reiterating those is a steady drumbeat to these conversations that also follows me out. I'm just realizing follows me outside of these conversations when I'm having challenging conversations around race, especially with other white folks. I now have these particular agreements in my head, and so I hear the drumbeat of no right to comfort, welcome conflict, ask for what you need, whatever the other thing is, resist binary thinking. So those are a couple of functions that it serves for me, and it lets me be brave in this space because I understand where the bounds are, and I understand when you and I wander close to or away from them, that we are no longer having the conversation that we intended to have.
I mean, part of my learning journey is to name when what is coming out of my mouth is that's me looking for comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And to name that in conversation transparently,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm having a hard conversation around race or any other topic that is within that wheelhouse, it gives me a reflective pause that I've reminded myself at the beginning of the conversation. And this is where I would like to be, but I recognize that I just wandered, like you said, kind of wandered off the path a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So keeping those in mind makes this more than an exercise that we did 12 weeks ago, and it was what we were supposed to do, and
Right. Mm-hmm.
that it has really made it a living part of a value set that we bring into each individual conversation. And I'm with you. I think that it's important, not redundant. As a human, I have a hard time remembering all sorts of things. And this centers me and prepares me in a thoughtful way for having a conversation that is about hard things sometimes.
Yeah. I'll say one more thing and then I'll segue into my white lady check-in, which is that the ritual also sinks me into the space. So no matter how careful I am about hedging out a little bit of space before these conversations, because I know that I'm going to be holding a fair amount of space for them, for my story, for challenging ideas, for things like that. No matter how careful I am about that, real life always follows me like 30 seconds into the door. And there is a beloved chaos there that going through the working agreements helps me transition from my life to this conversation. That's wonderful. So, one of the conventions that Patricia and I have developed over the course of this series is a White Lady check in, which is to check in with each other and you, if you would like to contribute to this particular part of the conversation about how whiteness has shown up for us in the last week. And one of the functions that serves is helping us see what our culture tries to invisibilize. Our culture, by benchmarking whiteness, and often by benchmarking womanhood as the normal, especially cis womanhood, but I'm not going to restrict it exclusively to that. The dominant culture, Western US, Midwest, all of these things, dominant culture works to render whiteness and our identities invisible. And so practicing looking for them, practicing looking for these characteristics, how they manifest in our lives, is a really useful exercise. Also, something that we have really only touched on a little bit in this series, but if you do any kind of racialized learning, comes up frequently, often, and loudly, and it should, is that privilege is invisible. Privilege is often the absence of obstacle. or the absence of punishment or something like that. And so you cannot really see an absence. And so working to see whiteness, working to see those absences, those holes, helps you understand that you are in a racialized system, even if you do not feel like you're having a racialized experience. Yes, you are. It's just easier.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, whiteness showed up many, many ways this week. But the most recent one today is that I was reading some histories that were written in a race blind way. And one of the chapters in the book gets deeply into why race blindness is racism, specifically. I was going to say specifically anti-Black racism, which is true, but not only that. And the reason for that in this specific context is that if you are writing any kind of history in depth in a way that is race blind or class blind or gender blind, you are not actually giving adequate context to what's going on there. You're assuming that whatever the dominant narrative is the narrative, that this history is the only history. And without that context, it's actually really difficult to know what's going on. And I am trying to read for racial history and for class history. And in the literature that I'm in, that currently doesn't exist. And that makes the work that I'm trying to do very frustrating and very difficult. So that's one way that whiteness has shown up for me, is who got to tell the story decided what story got told.
Can I ask a couple questions about that? Yeah. So have you developed any tool for identifying that something may very well be a racialized lie? Like, is there any flag that it's omitted?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I'm thinking specifically about like New York history. When I lived in New York City, mm-hmm. One of the big lies that we were told was that Central Park was this beautiful public works project, that there was nobody except for vagrants and ne'er-do-wells living in, I'm forgetting how many miles Central Park is, but massive, right? In the middle of this amazing city. And ruh-roh. Really? Mm-hmm. And then you suddenly stumble upon something, Seneca Village, and you realize that they were uncovering churches and graveyards and storefronts and every symbol of a cohesive community, when everything that was written in the paper was very much about vilifying the communities that were there, which was mostly fresh Irish immigrants and freed slaves that had settled in Seneca Village, but that essentially got paved over, right? So I kind of think about now, like, and that was an eye-opener for me. I'd probably been in New York for 15 years and never questioned the narrative about Central Park's creation. Mm-hmm. And then ran across this story and then suddenly realized that, like, no, that was a whole community. What it makes me wonder about is anytime I see splash, like there's got to be another story, right? So omission, but also whole scale villainy, like portraying whatever population that is being written out of the narrative as villainous in some way.
That's true, but in the Central Park story, the villainy actually happens external to that story, right? Like you don't get the story of Irish immigrants and freed Black folks from the story of Central Park. You only get that from Seneca Village. So I think, in what I'm hearing from your story, another red flag that I look for / listen for is the tabula rasa, the blank slate. No one lived here. This had never been talked about before. It's never been done this way before. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are those things true, or have we not inquired deeply about our own history or the history of folks adjacent to us? I'm not saying that innovation never happens. Absolutely not. But those absolutes make me question. The first thing is who's telling the story, and who might they not be seeing?
Who benefits from having the
for sure.
hero narrative?
For sure. Ooh. Oh, I felt that one in my body, actually.
I mean, one of the things that when I was really early on at Fordham University is where I went to school, and I took it was critical thinking about the media, and that was kind of a weird eye opener about, that I think led to me more, but not often, questioning historical narratives, because I realized how pervasive advertising is. Even that was essentially, Central Park was a really good advertising before ad men were a thing. But yeah, like how to recognize that something's missing, I think just assumes that there's a lot missing.
So my friend and colleague Molly has taught me about a concept that is found, I think, in the social sciences, called positionality, which is identifying your relationship to the work that you're doing. And that's really important for folks, especially who are doing research or writing in the social sciences, because identifying your positionality with respect to the work helps folks coming behind you identify what biases, implicit or explicit, you might have, what identities you might be carrying into the work that might be influencing how you think or talk about some things. And positionality can be race, class, gender, ethnicity, region that you're from, language that you speak, level of education attained, the folks that you spend the most time with. Positionality with respect to the work that you're doing kind of conditions the work that you do and how you do it. I think the social scientists are so canny in recognizing that. I wish the rest of us did. I wish we had positionality literacy. So one of the things that I've started doing is, when I am reading histories, trying to understand for myself the positionality of the person who's doing the writing or the people. And in the example that I gave a moment ago, it's a white woman who I've read a lot of her writings, and it's not that she omits race entirely. She has done some careful documenting of particular areas of African American history, but it is typically separate from the histories of white folks. And that, I don't want to say it makes me nervous, because it doesn't. It just makes me know that I need to read the writing with a critical eye, that I'm not reading everything that there is to understand.
That makes me think about my field, philanthropy. I don't know that there's been a definitive history of philanthropy, but I am 99.999% sure that most people only see it in terms of white supremacy in power as a philanthropic construct. Yeah, I don't know if I am informed enough to speak more about that, but the history of philanthropy is about, I believe, white males avoiding taxes and doing bad things to their workers in the world in those terms, and then white women like me essentially laundering their money and their reputation for them. Unless we switch the dynamic, which that's what my work is hopefully more about now, but I recognize my participation in being one of those white ladies that helped old white dudes launder their money and their reputations. It's a very sweeping statement. There's a lot of people in philanthropy, but I feel like it's a kind of majority rule in there. It would be an interesting history to uncover. Sure. So thank you for that.
How's it shown up for you this week?
It is spring, almost summer. I live in a predominantly white neighborhood in outside of Ann Arbor. And how it shows up for me is in the lawn wars. that make sense?
But you're going to explain it.
I'm going to explain it. So when I was in New York, I rented a very small apartment, and I rented in a couple places in New York, one for most of my life. But when I lived in Brooklyn in New York, I was introduced to this idea of your front yard is a new living space. And, that's kind of how it was used. And, now I'm in this very conservative, and that was in a neighborhood that was, me being white, I was definitely I'm talking about the neighborhood that I was in Brooklyn in particular. I was definitely a minority. Me and my white roommate were a minority in that neighborhood. It was a lot of Puerto Rican and first, second generation Italian were mostly in that neighborhood. And they had lawn furniture, and they treated the front yard like lawn. So I brought that to my place when I owned a house here, and I had a front yard that was essentially, me living my life. We had a fire pit, all sorts of things out there, and we do permaculture. So I didn't really have a yard, and I had a lot of complaints. And when I was an owner, I got away with a lot more. And now that I'm a renter in that same neighborhood and doing that same behavior, there's a lot of complaints to my landlords. And I find it really, there's something about participating in that is opening my eyes to the privilege that I had and have, both as an owner, as a white owner, and now as a white renter.
So why is this racialized?
I feel like it's racialized because there's, I guess it's just that I'm noticing that it's, in my experience, mostly white people that are doing it. And when I say it, I mean having perfect lawns that have a vista to the house, and in my estimation, wasted space. That it's somehow a signaling of what's not allowed in this. Like, we don't like people walking through the neighborhood. I don't know if I'm starting to get down a rabbit hole that maybe I can't yet fully articulate why it feels racialized to me. But it feels like white privilege. Having a lawn that does absolutely nothing else.
It's for sure class. It's for sure class, right?
Okay.
Like, you have these class expectations of, we do certain things here and not others. I don't think you're wrong about it being a racialized experience, but I'm just interested in teasing out more why. Part of the reason that I think it is racialized and that it's difficult for us to see is, so I know Patricia's neighborhood. I know where she lives. I also know a little bit too much about zoning and property deeds. And I know that a block and a half over from where she lives is a whole tract of homes that were built with what's called racially restrictive covenants, which is homes that were intended to be occupied only by white folks and never by people of color, specifically Black folks, unless they were domestic servants.
And written into the homeowner's agreement.
Written into the homeowner's agreement. You could not buy unless you were a white person, and you could not sell it to anyone unless they were a white person. And so that was not that long ago. That neighborhood, block and a half over from you, was built in the 1950s. So I think, and because your neighborhood today is mostly white, like yours and this one that's contiguous to yours, that is absolutely an artifact of the history that you've inherited in that neighborhood. So I do think that there's a racialized component to it. I'm just, as I'm listening to you, I am working to tease apart, even though it's intersectional, working to tease
and
apart.
And I'm working on the same thing and not finding the verbal aspect of it, but recognizing that it is class. But I also, I do really think that it's race, that there's something that is in the complaint stream. If your yard does not look uniform, or if you're using your yard in a way that is not what is considered, the proper way to do it. Yeah. So I don't want to go too far down this, because I feel like this is a whole other series that we could talk about.
Patricia
and
wants to
Order.
call it Law and Order, and she
Law
should
and
write it.
Order.
You guys tell her she should write this.
I'm going to write an article on it one day when I can figure out the
Mhm.
words. But it's been a really interesting thing that as I've been doing my own anti-racism work, to go from being an owner who had some complaints, but not really energetic complaints, to being a renter who then had tons of complaints. So now I'm no longer owning property,
Mm.
right? And
Mhm.
I'm in a racialized, the racial covenant
Mhm.
area, so that is like an experience of how else would somebody who is not white get into this neighborhood,
Mhm. Mhm.
other than, as a renter. And I'm talking about in the days of the racial covenants, but also to the inherited,
Mhm. Yep.
that's a generational flow on.
And
Anyway.
I will call out, so I've been thinking about this too, about why is this racialized? Because I believe that it is. Here's one way. The insistence to comfort, right? Like my visual discomfort is your problem. You do not have a unified lawn, a uniform lawn. You don't have a lawn at all. Your front bit is totally ungovernable, and I love that. But yeah, their visual comfort is your problem.
Because the complaint I get is you are ruining my view of
Right.
my house.
That's right. Isn't there a whole song called "That Sounds Like a You Problem," but also "That Sounds Like a White Problem"?
It
Okay.
is. I mean, it's something that I can't quite compute about
Yeah.
why they would have a problem with what I'm doing on my house.
Mhm.
But like, that's the complaint that I get. Anyway, I'm going to get off that
No, I
subject.
appreciate that you brought that
But
up.
yeah, Jess and I'll have a future debate after I write my article called Law and Order. Wait for it.
It's coming.
It's coming. Jess,
So
will you bring us into the next portion that
I
we're supposed to
will.
be
I
talking
will.
about?
As I was getting ready for this conversation, this particular conversation, I was I'm looking for the right verb. I'm gonna miss. I'm gonna miss this series when we're not having these conversations. And you and I have these conversations all the time. But it is also a lovely way to spend time with you. And I have loved my learning, So in doing my preparation for today, I went back through all of the notes that we've made for every single episode, and I thought it would be nice to return to the very beginning and talk about what brought us into the series and what we hope to get out of it. So I'll start with what brought us in, and I'll just read my note that I made at the very beginning, which is that I thought I got a pass out of needing to do what I thought of at the time as diversity work. First of all, didn't being poor, queer in the South, or a woman anywhere get me a ticket out of needing to work on other people's problems as I thought about it then? I remember having the thought minority people should work on minority issues. I would just get in the way. And that, until about 10 years ago, was what I thought, that I got a pass. And then I stepped slowly into an understanding of myself as a racialized person, our culture, our entire culture is racialized, and that I actually understand the world a lot better when I understand the constructs of race and how they're applied in every part of my life, every part of life that touches me, and the ones that I'm curious about. So that's what brought me into this kind of larger conversation.
I resonate with so much of that
See?
statement. That for years I felt that growing up poor and being female, I'm somehow exempt, right? I get to claim my ticket to being the underrepresented, the repressed, the whatever. Like, of course I couldn't be racist. So yeah, I just want to recognize, like, I could just say, yes, I agree with Jess.
Right.
But I'll read the one that I started with. And that is, I felt the tug towards this work as I was becoming more and more frustrated with my work in a fundraising profession that didn't actually seem to care about relationships. As I looked closer at that and began to put words to the feelings it brought out, I found in myself a great deal of shame in my own perspective and privilege as I was digging deeper into the learning process and realizing how much of my own sense of good work in the world and being a person who did good work in the world was based on toxic systems of inequality and skewed power structures. And I was right in the middle of that. And I was benefiting from that. And I was building a career on that. And it felt like such a rotted foundation. I'm even feeling like a little choked up as I say that. That's still very present for me. You know, I recognize I'm still working in a system, certainly working for change, but it's still very much a broken system. Like it shouldn't exist. So I'm essentially doing work in a place and in a profession that I hope one day will not need to exist. And that really screws up being somebody who feels like they do good work in the world. It's problematic and complicated.
Being human is complicated, man.
Oh, yeah. So Jess also pulled out our original comments about what did we expect from this experience. So Jess, I'll invite you to say, so how many, was it 12 weeks ago that we started this?
Oh, I'm not gonna
count. I'm going to say 12 weeks ago that we started this. So 12 weeks ago, this is the Jess from 12 weeks ago. What did you hope to get from this experience?
I said I hope to continue to build the muscle of talking to white people about race, including addressing individual behaviors in groups, organizations, and systems I'm in. I find that one-on-one thing really hard, and I know I need to get better at it. That is exactly what I did in these conversations. You know, that point of including addressing individual behaviors and groups, organizations, and systems I'm in. I know where I was the moment that you and I stepped into this conversation. I know that I was struggling in particular with two sets of relationships with white women colleagues that I wasn't totally sure what I was looking at, and I didn't know how to address it. And I feel like this book has given me a lot of language and sort of empowered me to be more proactive in defining the characteristics of white culture. And I don't think they're necessarily universal, although I think you can paint a lot of it, especially in the United States, with a broad brush. But even just in the ecosystems that I'm in, you know, Midwest, nonprofit, you know, community driven, racial reckoning, like whatever it is, there are some common characteristics and common behaviors. And I feel like I do have much better language around that. I don't even have to speculate if I'm better about doing this, because through the course of having these conversations with you, I have been having conversations in the rest of my life with people, both who are enacting harmful behaviors and people who are in rooms where these behaviors are happening, and being more up in solidarity with the values that I am trying to live and trying to work in concert with people on. So that the book has been my partner often refers to toast as a substrate for whatever you actually want to eat, you know, whether it's peanut butter or jelly or whatever it is. And I feel like the book was the substrate for really meaningful conversations in my life here and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. That's a wowza. Mm-hmm. I like that reflection a lot. And to think about how we're taking this practice into our daily practice with people who don't necessarily know what the rules are, but are, or at least the rules that we're carrying. But by our behavior, I think are responding, at least in my experience, respond positively to the way I question things, to the grace that I give, but also the boundaries that I'm setting. And I feel that too. So me too. Okay, we're done. So what I said about at the very beginning, what do I expect from this experience, was, as always, deepening my understanding, changing my behavior, finding ways to engage this work that is both loving and holding myself and my community accountable for creating a world I want to live in. The outcomes from this conversation that I think with you, Jess, I have even deepened a practice that we were already kind of in progress
for many years.
But now, like, we kind of took that as a learning thing and then solidified it and named things in this that now I'm using in my relationship with my partner. And, you know, even you and I had a really transparent conversation over dinner that I can't imagine having 4 or 5 years ago at the dawn of our friendship, about money, about the exchange of money. We were talking about a project that we were doing together and talking about what we wanted to be paid and not assuming that it was just going to be free because we were friends. And I take that as part of this experience again. And that's why I really feel like this anti-racism work is so essential for me as a white person to become a whole person.
Yes. Yes. A white person to become a whole person has to do the anti-racism work.
Right.
That.
Right. So I would say that I'm not there yet. I don't know if there is a there at the other end of it, but I know that I become more and more whole because I'm tearing down some walls. And that's every conversation that we have and every loving accountability moment, you know, with you, with others, with myself, that is tearing down a wall, and I can become the person I want to be. And because I'm becoming that person, I think there's ripples. I mean, I think that is my work in the world. So maybe that's where I'm supplanting my sense of good work in the world. Is my good work in the world is to first start with my own unwrapping of my own racism.
Always.
So that's my outcomes. Just getting better, burning brighter. And I would say deepening my friendship and beloved community with you.
100% true. You're welcome, everyone. Patricia and I love each other more. Which means more love in the world, and that is good for everyone. I wanted to talk about in this conversation, you know, so we've talked about how we constructed these conversations. One of the things that we did behind the scenes was after each session, Patricia and I would lean on a practice that one of our local businesses engages in, the Zingerman's community of businesses. If you know Zingerman's, you know they have a ritual for everything, and they have a ritual for ending things. And it includes asking yourself and others, what did you like best about whatever just happened, and what could be done better next time? And that like best next time thing, I have used that for almost a decade now in a million different scenarios, and it always gives me really like productive feedback. And so I wanted to bring in some of our like best next times, although I've switched it up to next time like best, because it looks a little bit more like we did the stuff on purpose instead of learning it on the way. But Patricia, how do you want to do this? Do we want to read it? Do we want to conversationalize it?
You know, I'll start with one and then you would take the next one. I mean, we can kind of pass it off to each other if we feel like one point's not for us. So one of the things that we had a wonderful bit of feedback from our friend and viewer, Truly, asked for a concrete example. And that was quite early on about, like, we were talking about something very theoretical, which I think that's, you know, I'm trying to remember. There's a wonderful list by an author, and I can't remember all of the things right now, about indicators of white supremacy being present. I'm trying to remember. They're like, it was like a list of 12. Oh, it's very famous, and I can't pull it out of my head right now. But, you know, like one of the examples of white supremacist behavior is intellectualizing things and not pulling the balloon down to the ground. So this was a wonderful reminder from one of our viewers about, I need a concrete example. You guys are talking about things very theoretically. And so one of the things that Jess and I try to incorporate more is, here's a concrete example of X is happening, Y is happening, or,
And it's helpful for
anything that
us
we're talking.
too, right? Like
Mhm.
it wasn't just for Truly, it was to help us understand, is this a concept that I totally understand? Let me try to locate it in my life.
Mhm.
That was so productive.
So one of the examples just now of me trying to get to a concrete example was, excuse me, Jess was talking about not being able to find full histories, that it was always written from a white perspective. Well, tell me if what is a flag of that? So that's a concrete example.
I appreciate that.
And I'm trying to remember any other ones. I think they naturally come up, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jess, I'm going to put you on the next one because that's all you, because you are our tech guru here.
Right. So I am going to do that one, but I'm going to steal the next one too.
Right.
One of the really practical learnings is that we use a third-party broadcast system to be able to do these lovely LinkedIn Lives with you. And there is a lag between what we say and what you hear. And we learn that at the very beginning. So now we go a little bit slower, which leads me into my next one that has nothing to do with tech at all, which is early on, but not immediately. You and I clocked with each other that we were listening to talk. We were listening to be clever, to have quick, banter, to go back and forth. We were performing. We were not listening to listen. I've thought of it since then as words like rain, where we were just basically clay and not letting anything in because we were just waiting to serve up the next bit of words, like just throwing rain back at the sky, basically. And something that you and I kind of self course corrected earlier on is in listening more deeply. And so when you hear the pauses with each other, when you hear the deep breaths, that is us really taking in what the other person is saying, which we weren't being intentional about at the beginning.
And that for me is life lesson. How can I stop the chatter in my head, which usually wants to present myself as the smartest person in the room? I've got 3 points and I would like to get those involved, and I'm just waiting for you to stop talking. That we have, since we both kind of named that for each other, I'll tell you from my perspective, like a lot of times I go into a broadcast thinking, I want to talk about X. And we get off on something else that's very wonderful and deep, and I'm listening to you, and I'm not going to go back and derail us to talk about X because that was the smart thing that I had to say. I would rather be present. Knowing how to do, can I take the next one? Because
it's a perfect segue. Yeah.
I'm laughing because this is all me. This is all me. Knowing how to deeply listen, but also tell focused stories. Bless me. Making notes as we go along. I'm not a particularly focused storyteller. I am what is known now in my loving family as a squirrel chaser. So, and I have a partner who's a squirrel chaser too. So God help us if we never get through a conversation. But being a better listener, as well as listening to myself when I am wandering away from any kind of a point.
So those were some things that we sort of, again, held up the mirror on. It wasn't just about content. It was about how we were having the conversations. And I'll be honest, every way that we corrected on sort of a, I don't want to use that word, on a means of communication, on how we were talking and not just what we were saying, honestly really enriched the conversation. Like I stressed a little bit preparing for these for the first couple of sessions because I did my homework, I did my research, I looked up all my own links. I had these 12 things that I wanted to say in a not very long conversation, and releasing myself from that and understanding that the juice of the juice isn't showing that I've done a good book report. It's in syncing to relationship with you and understanding with you in my life how these concepts around whiteness, around niceness, around silence, around these constructs that I intuitively understand but have not really been able to explicitly see, that has really been kind of the home run of this whole thing.
And I'll go back to our loving accountability thing. One of the things that you said to me is that in these debriefing feedbacks was, in a loving way, calling me into the work about, I'm noticing that you're having a lot of stories about capitalism and not about race. Our work here is the race. Like, I still think about that feedback because that truthfully was you calling me into our number one value, that I was looking for comfort because I could say capitalism is awful. And of course, I'm not a racist. Yeah, over there, so those things, I think the debrief of a conversation, and I debrief conversations with people that are not, like out in public, like, if I have had a tough conversation with somebody, I may ask a couple questions at the end. Hey, how are you feeling at the end of this conversation? Is there anything that you feel like we haven't said or that you wish we wouldn't have said? That's an amazing thing to do. Like, I certainly do it with my partner, but also too with all sorts of beloved friends and community members. Just to kind of check in, like, hey, are we okay? Did we get to say everything that we wanted to say? So a debrief is actually not a critical debrief. It is a checking in with the other person's heart, I think, too.
Enriching. So what do we like best?
I like best this conversational format. Jess and I were doing a prequel conversation, and we actually, before we would go on camera, and I think we, as the series wore on, we have shortened those prequel conversations because we would say all the good stuff.
We would be so juicy, guys. We would, like, the wisdom was there.
Well, and also too, our prequel conversations were much more conversational. And we were noticing that. And so, having that feedback about, like, we love being in conversation, essentially out in the world, and showing how loving conversation and accountable conversation can go. So that's one of my like best.
One of the ones that I have loved is that within the conversational format, we have both structure and flex time. So that we have the structure of the White Lady check-in. In previous sessions, we've had the structure of getting into the topic of the book, and kind of engaging the content. However we do, right? Whether it's really diving deep into the chapter or zooming out and saying, this is what it brought up for me. This is how this has shown up in my life, like however it was. And that combination of, ritual and free flow, man, that is just my zone of flow.
It's like a good jazz composition. You know where you're going. You know at least 4 or 5 guideposts, and then everything else is just jazz
interpretation.
Yeah,
sounds lovely.
I'm going to leave the next couple ones to you. I feel like the next 5 are yours.
Well, one we've already said, which is that we slowed down and we listened to listen. That's been just so lovely. As we've mentioned, a good flow of conversation. There have been times, so Patricia referenced a moment ago that, in talking about these constructs within capitalism rather than race is a way to point a finger rather than to understand where something is located inside of yourself and your life. And like, this note is specifically about you because it was from a specific session, but you had a vulnerability in one of these conversations that for me moved the needle on what I learned that day, because I watched you learn it real time and I was like, oh, I'm right there with you. So that vulnerability and that, like, being very present and very human in the moment, that might have been one of the most powerful moments you and I have shared together, at least from my experience. I was watching you change real time. What a gift. Whew.
Even at my advanced age,
Hush
I can change and
Shut
evolve. No, it's true. I mean, I strive to have a growth mindset. Part of that is getting rid of my right to comfort.
Right.
because that's not growth.
It's not. Kind of the opposite.
You got to rip the shell off and be kind of naked under the sea for a little while.
And soft and tender.
Permeable.
Jeez.
None of that sounds pleasant, but on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So, good flow of conversation. I think that was something we've already talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Bringing up active areas of confusion. I like the loving relationships that I have that I can say, could you talk about that a little bit more? Because I don't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of times I'll have people come to me afterwards like, I didn't understand that either. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a superpower to be curious.
Do you know there's this thing in corporate world where in let's say an ecosystem of where I know it is in service providers where you work in an ecosystem, you're competitors with each other. Kind of the quick wisdom is to say you know everything or to talk down about your competitors is a way to win people over. When what's much faster to get you credibility from people is two things: saying I don't know when you don't know, and to say
let me find out.
Let me find out, but X does such and such better, right? So not talking down about your competition, but speaking well of them, especially in the ways that are really honest and that and so that's really what that brings up for me.
It's been a lifelong joy I'm really glad that I don't have, I certainly have an ego, but I don't have such an ego that I'm not unwilling to say, could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I learned so much more. I hang around with really smart people.
Right. And for me, one of the joys of aging has brought an increasing joy in reaching towards the I don't know, and reaching towards the I don't understand that, because the conversations that come from I don't understand are way better the ones where I am a fire hose of information.
Yeah, that is true. So I want to recognize that we're getting to the close of the hour. We would like to offer for our people in Washtenaw County or beyond, if you want to take a trip to lovely Detroit, Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti. We'd love to do a gathering, and this is particularly focused on other white women. Certainly anybody who wants to come along. I know that we have a variety of people identifying as white and BIPOC in our audience, but specifically this is an invitation to other white women in the area to join me and Jess at our local brewery. It's called Ann Arbor Brewing Company in Ypsilanti, and I'll create an event for this. But Monday, June 12th from 5 to 7 p.m. It's going to be unstructured, but we'll just invite you to come along and, ask questions, get involved, chat. Like I said, we're not going to have we like to talk. So, and we are probably aggressively friendly. So you should have a nice time. And then, happily have conversations about, do we want to keep this going forward and create a group that can learn together, create culture together, and work on our own, unpacking our own racism and figuring out how to do it better in a supportive, loving community of other white women. So June 12th, 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Ann Arbor Brewing Company in person in Ypsilanti. If you're an insider, you call it the corner.
The corner. That's right. That's right. I was going to say something about the in-person thing, and it has escaped my mind. Oh, Patricia and I have enjoyed this format so much, which is to be in conversation with each other in community, that we have mostly decided that this will not be the last time we do this. So please keep an eye out for future conversations. And to that end, what we'd like to end on is how we can stay connected. So Patricia, can you talk about yours, because you are fancier than I am?
I was wondering, I don't know if I have the ability to put something up on screen.
If not, it's super easy to drop in the chat.
Oh, if I drop it in the chat, look at me go.
Drop it in the chat after the session.
Oh, I'm going to drop it in the chat after the session.
We can't do it live, right?
And I think we've all just realized that Jess is the technical advisor of this situation. So you can always find me on my website, particularly my blog. And that's Patricia, Patricia -Berry, BERRY. .com, and that's my website. And if you go to the blog, usually when we're announcing things like this series, as well as we're going to transcribe and put the full series out on my blog as well. You can also reach me through my website if you want to just send me an email, or you can find me at the Salty Fundraiser on Instagram.
Yes.
And it is salty.
It is, yes. Although less salty online than you are in person, which I enjoy.
There's a lot of garden stuff on my Instagram too.
There's a lot of garden. And then sometimes you get salty in the captions, which I always enjoy. So for me, you can find me on Millennial socials, which are Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the same handle everywhere, which is my first and last name, Jessica Letaw, JESSICALETAW, no punctuation. Feel free to come find us, chat us. We'll put that up in the comments for this session as well. And then, Patricia, I think we have done all the things.
I know that people have a lot of ways to spend their time.
Yes.
And I am really grateful that Jess, you spent your time here with me doing some beautiful work. And I am expressing my love for you. You're just wonderful. And everybody who's coming along, both during and after, drop a line, say hi, and thank you for spending your time on this work.
And thanks to Patricia for having this idea in the first place. Good job, all of us.